So we have a question that is very much related to this topic of cultural integration, and it's a question that's been driving our interest in bringing real information on migration to the greater population, and that is why, when it comes to migration to refugees, do we mainly get misinformation, and why is that misinformation largely negative? From our street surveys and from the news and a lot of cases we've seen around the world, this relates to a negative bias from the media and from politicians to quickly jump to conclusions about particular issues, whether it's an economic crisis, whether it's a security concern. Media tends to grab on to fears and issues and translate a sort of pessimistic perception of migrants into a bias, which perpetuates all of our biases in society. There is a concrete case of this that we'd like to go through with you all. Many Germans know this well. Many people around the world now know this well. I live in the United States currently, and I was constantly asked, oh, what is happening in Germany? And that is the event on New Year's 2016 in Cologne. This is a great example that we can unpack here of when misinformation triggers a public response and a political response based in a lack of fact. So this first image, very similar images appeared on newspapers and magazines around the world. What we know, or what we learned within a few hours of the so-called attacks, or night of the attacks, was that there were over 1,000 police reports filed, meaning individuals who were at a train station in Cologne on the evening of the 1st of January, filed a report with the police saying that they had been assaulted in some way, shape, or form. Very quickly, the descriptions provided to the police about these assaults became blended or one and the same with the so-called refugee crisis. Victims, or those who filed police reports, stated a North African phenotype. What we do know about Cologne is that North African immigrants, and not refugees, make up a part of the local landscape. So it's quite normal that if you are a victim of an attack and you see a face moving quickly past you, you take the next step and say, oh, it's a North African individual. We have a refugee crisis. It's a North African refugee, or it's a Syrian refugee. This image is taken from a very well-known newspaper in Germany. It's a little bit more conservative, related to Bild and other conservative publications. They printed this picture and said, most attackers at Cologne, Syrian refugees. This was not based on any actual information. The police in Cologne released a series of reports and saying, we think that many of these assailants have refugee status or have applied for refugee status. They did not say, we don't know for sure. It's actually unlikely. Since Cologne, a series of journalistic as well as public investigations have looked into the issue deeper, and they've confirmed that a very small percentage of the reports filed for crimes were committed by those awaiting asylum proceedings. So most of these individuals had been in Cologne for a much longer period of time and were part of an organized criminal network of North African immigrants with various types of status, very complicated history there, and very well known to the police there, in fact. This sign has been there for a long time at the train station, similar signs in West Germany, pointing to there's organized crime all over the European Union. It takes many shapes and forms. Only at this particular moment, where fears were high about the so-called refugee crisis, did a somewhat common problem of organized crime instantly become a migration problem and thus a refugee problem. So what can we learn from this clash of perceptions and fact, well, we can learn that we need more information, but also that it's very normal for us, for the public to become very quickly misinformed. We are aware that around the world there are very similar cases, unfortunately, where, for example, in the United States, in the political debate, if a crime is committed by someone who has immigration status, all of a sudden the media might report that it was an illegal, so an undocumented immigrant committing a crime against multiple people, when it might be someone who is actually a citizen who has migration background. So we would like to hear from you what in your countries of origin and in your memory and your experience is your cologne. Do you have any examples or situations in which some event has sparked sort of a train of misinformation? You can raise your hand. We will bring a mic to you. If you can't think of a concrete event, and this is something that I've been thinking about, in regard to the Paris attacks, so to this idea of security, has there been a newspaper article or a conversation, a situation in which it seems that people are misinformed or false information is being spread about a particular group?
Is this specific to sexual harassment?
It is not.
Okay.
So this is a very specific issue, okay, and we're trying to broaden it and just talk about migrants being connected to crime.
Oh, so it is. The question or your request was misinformation by press. So it's just connected to migrants then?
If possible, yes, please.
Okay. Well, my example wasn't that.
Okay. Well, you may provide your example nonetheless.
Okay, thank you very much. Flint, Michigan.
Ah.
I think it's a great example.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually very similar. So.
That's what I thought when you were talking, although it wasn't directly covering that area. But
please expand for those who might not be as familiar with Flint.
A few years ago, Flint, Michigan, if you know Michael Moore, he's from Flint. And his first movie was called Roger and Me. And it was about the demise of the auto industry in Michigan, in Flint, Michigan. Years later, in fact, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they changed the source of the water from the Detroit water system to a system of a river that was running through Flint, Michigan, which was terribly contaminated. People were lied to about how good the water was, the quality of the water. In fact, what turned out is that the water was poisoned by lead, and many people, especially young people, were poisoned by the water and suffered debilitating effects of the water. Now, at the point where they changed the water system, the media went along with the government. You know, this is going to be a great thing, and you know, everything's being covered, and actually always would report positively about the new water. As we know right now, I don't know, how many people here are aware of the Flint water situation? Okay. Well, just imagine that you went home now to your Wasserhahn or to your tap, and when you poured yourself a glass of water, it was contaminated with lead, and people told you not to drink it. What would be your alternative, you know? And people were actually paying for the water. They were actually paying the bill. They were being charged for this contaminated water. So that's my example.
Yeah, to reinsert our frame to the Flint situation, it tends to be vulnerable populations, so in the United States, the black population, that becomes the victim of these cycles of misinformation, predominantly because newspapers and sources of media, as well as academic institutions, like to stick to a more comfortable narrative. And in the United States, it's a narrative of, well, we're all just doing our best and environmental justice is not necessarily at the top of the page. So for us, when it comes to migration, we know that things are deeper and more complex than an official narrative of, well, refugees come here and they wait for status, and maybe in between things get sloppy and they commit crimes. We know that there's a lot more gray zone there. Some don't come because they really want to live here. Some don't stay for very long. Some experience very different asylum proceedings based on where they come from. So our aim is to complicate that story with evidence and with scholars from very different backgrounds themselves. We hope that our presentation has provided some food for thought in terms of the role of fact and knowledge in justice. So we would like to plug our project wholeheartedly, and would be thrilled if you would become subscribers to our video lecture series, as well as bring your comments and your concerns about migration, about misinformation regarding discrimination in the media to us, so that we can better design our course around your concerns. All of our information is here. We will be sending out newsletters with the actual videos shortly. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, we're in 3 different cities, and very much look forward to this project developing with your help. And I think that's it. Oh, yes.
I don't want to keep you much longer than you need. I think the topic today is about cultural integration, right? And I think the issue of Cologne, for me, is perhaps one of the most important issue that perhaps this symposium can relate to. And I'm talking here not so much about whether this or that group of people, but Islam in relation to women, which is, I think, much deeper than pointing the fingers. And perhaps maybe this is an area that merits, I think, a session on its own.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think we certainly agree that we need a lot more information as well about who's Islam, which type of Islam, which groups claiming to belong to Islam. And I think you only have a civil conversation in a society that's really prioritizing real inclusion beyond just integration if you make room for multiple voices. And that starts largely with information and not just with sort of a one individual headline. But it's certainly a big challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity to be cheesy.
And on a practical level, just to let you know, this first clip that you saw with Hinde Haas, it's part of our How and Why Migration Happens module, which is the first module that we've tackled. And some of the ones coming up focus more on what happens after the migrants arrive, the immigrants arrive, the idea of social cohesion, integration, intercultural relations. So that's definitely a topic that we'll be looking at in the future. And we did mention this is free, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is
I think
free.
we did, hopefully. The subscribing is free. The videos are free. Please share. If you have, for instance, you are involved in an organization and they, how they have a website, because who doesn't have a website these days, and you'd like to embed our videos on your page, that's totally welcome as well. So we're open to partnerships and collaborations as well.
Any more questions? Yes, in the back. Does anyone have a microphone that can...
I think this might have to be the last question.
Yes, sorry.
Well, I'll yield to someone else if if they have a, okay. Is this term, in English, we have the word migration, of course, and we have this word migrant. Mm-hmm. And migrant in America, at least in my lifetime, we had the term migrant workers. And some of these people would be from Mexico, but a lot of them would be American citizens. Does your project consider people who are indeed citizens who might fall into the category of being migrants themselves?
I'm going to answer this, and then I'm going to let Sophia answer this as well. Yes, because we've spent time in both Germany and the United States, and I currently live in the United States, I can say that each country deals with this status of immigrant and migrant very, very differently. And we are approaching that with the utmost care. So, I mean, certainly in the United States, there are very many citizens who also in our history have actually been deported because of their migrant background. In Germany, there are very many citizens who are still considered migrants because of their background. So our aim is to probe and really poke at these categories and unpack them. Our focus right now is Europe, but we are aiming for a transatlantic perspective, and I think it just becomes richer that way because, as you mentioned, in the United States, it's a very complicated terrain in terms of this term migrant. And I will add, immigrant and migrant in the United States are not necessarily the same thing. In Germany, migrant is used more than immigrant, so it's hard work, but we're doing our best.
Sure. And just to add to that, going back to this example of Migrationshintergrund in Germany, migration background, you know, a lot of people see that as very problematic because second, third generations are still categorized as migrants, even though they're born here and have citizenship and now are allowed to have dual citizenship, finally. But in terms of belonging and community, that can be problematic, and identity. But sometimes these labels are also important for things like collecting data and for providing programs and targeting targeting groups for policies. So while Germany has an issue a little bit with this term, you know, a country like France that operates under this, we're secular, you know, everyone's equal, no showing of your religious identity. They don't use these categories, and they also forbid the collecting of data of groups based on ethnicity, which can also be seen as problematic because then they can't target groups in certain ways for beneficial policies. And in terms of our project, we've looked a lot at this categorization of refugee versus economic migrant, which is something you hear ad nauseum right now in the press. And we're trying to complicate that narrative because, you know, I'm sure a lot of you are immigrants as well or have lived abroad, and you wouldn't necessarily say that you came just to study or just to see a new country or just to have a job or just for a relationship. We're humans and we're complicated beings and we have multifaceted identities, and this categorization is just far too simplified. So it's something we'll definitely be looking at. And as we're both American citizens, we very much hope to get the money one day to go to the States for this project and talk to people over there as well.
Okay, thank you, and another round of applause for our honored guest, please.